Hello there and welcome friends. This is a guide with everything you need to know about how to make a very up-to-date intelligence or sorcery based build for patch 1.05. Now sorceries in Elden Ring have always been amazing even at the start, but now through the recent patches, a lot of the lesser known sorcerers have been buffed in power. And with this guide we'll cover them all. Close range spells including melee spells, medium range spells with very nice area of effect for enemy packs, the best long range spells to easily snipe foes, and of course the ultimate boss destroyer spell. So without further ado, let us get started, and first with class selection as usual. Now when it comes to class, Astrologer is still the best choice by far. Your starting stats are great with a heavy focus on intelligence, which we need anyways, and your starting spell selection is also the best, including what's pretty much one of the best area of effect spells in the game that can actually last you through the end game itself. While you can also go with Prisoner, I'd much rather go with Astrologer. As for the Keepsake, as usual go with the Golden Seed. The extra Flask charge matters a lot for a Mage character early game. With that out of the way, let's now talk about the best spells your Sorcerer can get for each situation, as to truly handle everything, even without summons. First with the best ones against normal enemies, and after that I'll cover the boss destroying spells. I want to start with the best medium range spells, as these are pretty much your bread and butter sorceries that you'll use for most of the game against most of the enemies. While I say medium range, they actually have quite decent range. The first one is Rock Sling. Not only can you get this extremely early, pretty much at the same place you get the very powerful Meteorite Staff, and I've already covered the location in my last Mage guide that you can find linked to the site here or down below in the video description, but this spell can carry you quite far. There are actually many advantages to this spell. First, the damage is physical, even though it's chaos based on your intelligence and staff. What this means is, against many of the enemies in the game that are highly resistant to magical damage, such as the Red Wolf of Radagon, this spell will do full damage. Second, it inflicts very high poise damage if all of the balls hit the enemy, which is pretty easy to do. By just spamming Rock Sling, you can easily break the enemy's stance, which then lets you hit them with a critical hit if you go for a melee weapon, or just give you a window to heal or spam even more spells as they recover. Lastly, the enemy artificial intelligence doesn't really know how to properly dodge this spell. As you can see here, whenever you cast it, the enemy will attempt to dodge, which doesn't help them because the balls hit them regardless, as they will seek the enemy after that. For my second and third best medium range spells, we have the ever so useful Glintstone Pebble and its upgrade, Great Glintstone Shard. It is true that Glintstone Pebble is just a starter spell, but believe me when I say that it does remain useful for most of the game. The range is decent, the FP cost is low, and the damage is pretty good as well. When it comes to Great Glintstone Shard, it was actually buffed in one of the recent patches, so that it can properly compete with Glintstone Pebble. It does cost a little bit more FP, 18 instead of 11, for a nice boosting damage. Here's when you should consider using either Glintstone Pebble or Shard. If you can one-shot the enemy with Pebble, then by all means, use the Pebble to defeat them. However, you'll notice that some enemies can only be one-shot with Great Glintstone Shard, and this is where it shines. After all, you don't want to waste time casting either of these twice for the normal enemies, that is. Use the one that allows you to one-shot them, depending on how high their hit points are. For the early and mid bosses, go with Rock Sling instead. With that out of the way, let's now cover the best area of effect spells. They actually also have medium range, just like our previous spells. The first one is the ever so powerful Glintstone Arc. This is also a starter spell for the Astrologer, but honestly, it is by far the best area of effect sorcery until around the end game. Even at the end game, it still remains quite powerful, as you can see from these enemies here, who get easily torn to pieces by it. Glintstone Arc not only has decent range, but the arc itself also travels far away and can pierce through multiple enemies. Lastly, the damage is quite good, and the FP cost is pretty low. For the second best area of effect sorcery, we have a Talisman Blade. This spell unleashes a very powerful Great Sword Arc at the enemies that does travel a bit as well, just like Glintstone Arc, and can pierce through enemies. The reach of the sword is also very wide, and because it is a frost spell, it can actually inflict frostbite upon the enemies, for even more damage and also as a way to reduce their defenses. The only downside of this spell is that, well, it takes quite a while to get. It requires you to be at the very end of running the Witch's quest. And I also have a guide for the entire Runny's quest that you can check, linked to the side here. Now let's talk about the best long-range debuffing spell in the entire game, especially against bosses, Runny's Dark Moon. It does have somewhat slow casting time, but the moon itself that you throw at the enemies can travel for a pretty long path. Once it hits the enemy, the damage is very powerful, but most importantly it also reduces the bosses or any enemy magical resistance by 20%. This doesn't mean that you deal 20% more damage, rather that it's going to reduce whatever magical defense value they have. The end result, however, is that you will inflict a lot more damage. Lastly, just like a Duelist Moonblade, this is also a cold spell, so can inflict frostbite on the enemy with repeated casts. Usually 2 to 3 casts is more than enough, even against bosses. Just look at how easy it is to handle Malenia's first phase, a boss that spawns somewhat far away from you, by just spamming Runny's Dark Moon. Also, whenever your character is inside the moon, you'll be floating, which makes you immune to ground-based attacks, such as enemy stomps. Against bosses, you always want to start by casting this. You can also get Runny's Dark Moon at the end of Runny's quest. And speaking about bosses, of course, let's now cover the ultimate boss-destroying sorcery in Elden Ring, the infamous and ever so powerful Comet Azur. This spell was already extremely powerful back on release, and it has remained unnerfed ever since, so for patch 1.05 it is still at full power. Trust me when I say that this spell alone can easily trivialize almost all of the bosses, with just a single cast. However, it's not just a matter of casting it, it's important that you know how to properly use it. You might have noticed that whenever you first cast it, the spell costs so much FP that it seems kinda disappointing. You won't really do much damage. This is why the first thing you should do is empower your Wondrous Physic mix with the Cerulean Hidden Tear, which makes your spell cost 0 FP, so basically you have infinite casting, for 15 whole seconds, more than enough to destroy everything with Comet Azur. You can get this Crystal Tear by defeating the boss at the Minor Erd tree, to the east of the Road of Iniquity Grace at the Mount Gilmir region. Now that we have infinite FP for Comet Azur, we need a way to ensure our Comet strikes the enemy. The problem with this spell is that it doesn't have any hyper armor. What this means is any strike that the enemy hits you with, even a light attack, is going to stagger you out of the casting, making your spell fumble, and you'll pretty much have to restart against the boss, because by the time you recover, you'll have wasted your infinite FP buff. There is a very easy way to avoid this, however, and it is all thanks to the Iron Jar Aromatic consumable. While under Iron Jar Aromatic, you actually have infinite poise, that's right. You cannot be staggered at all, unless you get hit with some attacks that will always stagger you regardless. Some enemies and bosses have these, but for most of their attacks, you won't be staggered, which means you can remain casting Comet Azur even when being hit. This is why my character here can easily take multiple hits from Malekith in both his first and second phase and still remain casting Comet Azur to easily destroy him. The only downside of Iron Jar is that it basically makes your roll into a fat roll, so the slowest of roll, no matter your equipment load. However, you can easily overcome this penalty by just equipping a light weapon like a dagger with the Bloodhound Step ability, so you can retain your fast dodge with the best invisibility frames possible. As far as spells to increase your damage, we have the very powerful Terra Magica. Whenever you cast this, your character will create a magical sigil, and so long as you are standing inside of it, or for a few seconds after you leave it, you'll increase your magical damage by a massive 35%. The increase is simply huge, and can make quite the difference. And here's a fun little fact. Because the sigil is quite long, ideally you want to cast Terra Magica right outside of the boss's fog wall. Then you enter the boss's room and can resume your Comet Azur. Notice how part of the sigil is sticking out, so we are still benefiting from it just fine. So ideally for bosses, you want to cast Terra Magica, drink Iron Jar Aromatic, quaff your infinite FP Flask, enter the boss room, and then you can begin with Comet Azur for a very powerful alpha strike. Alright, so now that we know how to easily destroy bosses, all that's left to do, spells-wise, is to talk about the melee range spells, and trust me, some of them can be quite powerful. Mages aren't as frail as you might think on Elden Ring. The first one is the ever so useful Carrion Slicer, and it is actually quite stacked. The magical sword comes out very fast after the initial cast, you can quickly chain it for as long as you have enough FP, the FP cost is super low, and the damage is very high for all of this spell can do. For the second best melee spells we have Carrion Piercer, a spell I've already talked about in my Spellblade build that you can find linked to the side here. When you use this, you basically conjure a big greatsword like spear that you use to impale the enemies with. The range is actually deceptively high, but most importantly, if you charge this spell, it will actually knock most of the enemies with low poise down, including low poise bosses like Melania, who you can easily stun lock for quite a lot of free hits, as you can see here. Also, the Piercer, as the name itself implies, can pierce through obstacles and enemies. We also have Gavel of Haima, a spell that was recently buffed in one of the latest patches. It is pretty similar to Carrion Piercer, except you conjure a big great hammer to bonk the enemies with, and this will also result in most enemies that have low poise being knocked down by the spell. Notice that if you alternate your casts with your staffs by dual wielding them, so you first cast with the right staff and then the left staff, you can keep on chaining this spell forever until you run out of FP. Now for our truly last close range spell, we have Rock Blaster, a sorcery that was heavily upgraded through a patch. This spell is basically a budget version of Comet Azur, if you may. Whenever you cast it, you can keep on channeling it for repeated amounts of damage, and then when you finally release the spell, it will unleash a huge burst surrounding your character for area of effect damage. The downside is that, unlike Comet Azur, well, it is very close range. On the other hand, unlike Comet Azur, this does have a decent amount of hyper armor, which means that you can take on some hits without being staggered out of it. Also, the intelligence requirement is super low, and you can get it very early. Now let's cover the best sniping sorceries in the game, Loretta's Great Bow and Loretta's Mastery. Both of these spells work pretty much in the same way. You conjure a magic Great Bow and then fire at the enemy. The beauty about these spells is of course the insane range. It doesn't get any better than that. You can truly hit enemies from the other side of the screen. Also, remember that if you free aim this spell, you can actually increase the range even further. Alright, so now that we know the best spells overall, let's finally get into the meat of the build. And as usual, I'll give you stat ranges so you can end starting from level 120 to even 150 depending on your tastes. Our stat allocation. When it comes to an astrologer or sorcerer, intelligence is your main stat, and you'll want to increase it until 80, that's right. 80 is basically the soft cap, and you do get quite a lot of extra sorcery scaling by going from 70 to 80, it is end loaded. Second, you also want a bit of mind. When it comes to mind, you do gain quite a lot more FP starting from 20, but I honestly would not go higher than 30. 20 to 30 is more than enough, because we do get quite a lot of extra FP flasks. Now you most certainly want Vigor as well. Vigor is important for pretty much all characters, even a ranged Sorcerer character. You should stop increasing Vigor at either 40 or then 60, which is the soft cap. Endurance is a matter of taste. There are ways to highly increase your defenses, even as a lightly armored Sorcerer, Mage character in Elden Ring, such as through Iron Jar Aromatic. I already have a tanking guide that you can find linked to the side here, where I cover pretty much all of the choices, so you don't have to rely on heavy armor, which then means you don't really need equipment load. It is true that your spells cost stamina as well, but frankly, the increase in stamina from endurance is so minimal at this point that it won't really matter that much. Especially when it comes to bosses, you're just deleting them with Comet Azur anyways, which doesn't drain stamina. I would leave endurance at around 50 to 20 if you want to increase it. Now when it comes to faith, it's going to depend on whether you want your character to be able to cast the low faith miracle buffs, some of which can help quite a lot like Golden Vow, and the damage negation ones. I would consider increasing faith up to around 20 to 25 if you want to cast these spells, but there are other ways to increase your damage even without them. And I also have a how to maximize DPS guide linked to the side here that you can check. The last of the points can go into strength and dexterity, that is, assuming you want weapons other than stabs. As an example, we have the Jellyfish Shield, which increases the power of all of your spells, and the Commander's Standard for another stacking damage buff. Jellyfish requires 20 strength, while Commander's Standard 24, but you can two-hand it for less. Or you can just go with the faith buffs instead. With stats out of the way, let's now cover our equipment, starting with our staves and weapons. The best staff overall for damage is without a doubt Lucid's Glintstone Staff. It does make your spells cost additional FP, but this doesn't really matter. Like I said, for your Comet Azur against bosses you have infinite FP, and for most of the normal enemies you have enough FP flasks as it is. For the start of the game, however, that is the early game, you should absolutely consider getting the Meteorite Staff. You can acquire it super early, and this staff is very unique in that it already comes with S scaling in intelligence, so you don't really need to upgrade it. It's only around mid-game when you get Lucid Staff that Meteorite Staff stops being that powerful. Plus it even boosts the power of Gravity Sorcery like the ever so useful Rock Sling spell. Now this is important, you can actually dual wield staffs in Elden Ring. As you can see, I have both the Carrion, Regal Scepter, and Lucid's Glintstone. While you get to choose the spell to cast spells from depending on your right or left hand, the most important part about dual wielding staffs is that you get the passive bonus applied twice. However, do note that whatever penalty your staff applies will also stack if you are using two staffs with penalties. Now let's talk about armor. Like I said before, you don't really have to go all out on heavy armor. As a mage character, you can still acquire high physical damage negation even without it. If you are going the Comet Azur route, then you certainly want Azur's Glintstone Crown, as this will increase the power of your Comet Azur at the cost of more FP. Other respectable choices are Renala's Hat, the Queen's Crescent Crown, because this will increase your intelligence by 3 points and doesn't have any downside. Or you can also go with the Twin Sage Glintstone Crown, which has double the benefits, so plus 6 intelligence instead of plus 3, at the cost of reducing your maximum hit points, however. Lastly, we have Runny's Hat, the Snow Witch Hat, to increase the power of cold spells. So basically, Adula's Moonblade and Runny's Dark Moon. But we also have Glintstone Ice Crag, if you prefer it instead of Glintstone Shard and its upgrade. For the chest, arm and leg slot, the choice is really up to you. If you want to go with fashion, Alberit's robe is by far the best looking one, at least in my opinion. Now let's talk about talismans, another very important slot for any mage character. First we have Radagon's Icon, which can increase your spellcasting speed by an extreme amount, to the point you don't really need to invest in dexterity for the same benefit. Honestly, just use Radagon's Icon. We also have the Graven Skull Talisman and its upgrade Graven Mask Talisman. They do stack with each other and increase the power of all of your sorceries. Lastly, the Ritual Sword Talisman, which also grants you a very high boost to damage, so long as your hit points are at maximum, which as a mage is pretty easy to do, especially for that very powerful Comet Azur Alpha Strike. If you're using charged spells, please remember that Comet Azur is not a chargeable spell. You can also use Godfrey Icon. For an example, we have the charged Carrion Piercer. Lastly, we also have the Magic Scorpion Charm, which increases your magical damage at the cost of lowering your damage negation. Lastly, when it comes to Wondrous Physic Flask effects, besides the Infinite FP Flask that I've covered before, we also have the very important Magic Shrouding Cracked Tear, which increases all of your magical damage, so pretty much all of your spell damage besides a few ones like Rock Sling, mostly the gravity spells. Also for the early game, don't forget the Intelligence Knot Crystal Tier, which can increase your intelligence by 10 points for 3 minutes, usually enough to get some spells going earlier, especially the ones with high intelligence requirement. Alright everyone, so this was it for my complete up-to-date Astrologer Mage Guide. I hope it was useful to you, and please remember to like and subscribe to help the channel if you can. Also, don't forget to comment down below if you think I missed on something. Thank you for watching and see you next time, friends.